tardes. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming to this presentation that is about the research in progress on the relationship between the Peruvian state and the Afro-Peruvian citizens. My goal is to explore the relationship in at least the last 7 years, but we need to do some kind of summarized recount of the history. Why I'm focused on the last 7 years? Because there was an unprecedented event when the Peruvian state asked for forgiveness to Afro-Peruvian citizens. Forgiveness, the state apologized, officially apologized to the Afro-Peruvians for the racism against them during the colonial times and Republican times. I have been working on Afro-Peruvian issues in the last 12 years. My doctoral research at UMass was about education policy and Afro-Peruvians. And this is research that at the same time led me to explore one of the sources of my own identity, which is the African roots. Okay, the official apology comes on November 27, 2009, and this was published in the Peruvian state newspaper the day after. According to, we're going to see now the official document, but there was a debate on Afro-Peruvian blogs about the discourse in this apology, or asking for forgiveness, because there was something like a grammatical mistake in Spanish several times or across the whole text. The document said se expresa perdón histórico al pueblo afroperuano, which means that the state gives historical forgiveness to Afro-Peruvian people, when the idea is the opposite. The state apologized to Afro-Peruvian people. So, and this looks like a grammatical mistake, but could be also ideological contradiction. Let me show the document. I'm not familiar with Mac. Please, Carol. How can I find it? Of course. So, from a critical cultural discourse analysis, we can work on the text and see that there are, in addition to this grammatical mistake, some, say, missing things in the resolution. For example, the issue of slavery is never mentioned. And this is a critical thing in this historical moment, because in the current discussion about policies for Afro-Peruvian people, the state is avoiding the concept of reparation. So this is something important to analyze here, and also the fact that this is a resolution, a document that, in addition to forgiveness, asks or pretend to include Afro-Peruvian people in the national citizenship, but the whole discourse in this document describes Afro-Peruvian people as the others. So this is something that we can see if we look at the document closely. Okay, I just want to mention that this is something that in this project we want to work line by line. Also, in this resolution, the state offered to perform an official ceremony where the President of the Republic, at that moment, Alan Garcia, is going to ask for this historical forgiveness, which happens the same year. Oh, sorry, I lost the video.
Send the link in the slide.
There are several, happily there are several videos. Okay. This is the official ceremony.
Que Dios perdone a todos estos que han engañado así, porque a pesar de haber ofrecido la libertad, la esclavitud continuó después del 28 de julio de 1821. Que Dios perdone a esos gobernantes de 1854-57 que solamente por ganar a los congresos liberales aceptaron terminar con la esclavitud y usaron a los esclavos como un argumento para dar dinero a las grandes familias, porque así fue. Aquí la libertad no se dio por principio. Tú eres libre porque eres mi hermano, porque Dios te ha hecho igual a mí. Aquí la libertad se dio a cambio de comprar la libertad. ¿Y para qué sirve eso? Para enriquecer al que se declara dueño de esclavos. Y todos saben cómo se inventaron nombres y días de esclavos morenos para cobrar más las familias. Que Dios los perdone.
This is just a segment, but you can see that first the president is mentioning here in this discourse the issue of slavery. So he put the issue of racism in the past. That was 150 years ago. And in addition to that, he said that he asked he mentioned God, saying God should pardon, forgive these slave owners. So there is a misconception about the issue of this ceremony. He didn't mention the structural racism of current Peruvian society. He's just putting that issue in the past, in some way trying to say that now we are a new democratic republic, and that is something that we overcome, that was in the past. So in some way, his discourse tried to avoid the current issue with racism in Peruvian society. Okay, going back to the PowerPoint. So to put the Afro-Peruvian situation in context, we can say that Peruvian society has a broad diversity, and is in some way difficult to describe this diversity because there is no official data about this diversity. But in the last 5 centuries, social miscegenation and cultural exchanges makes difficult to identify what is the cultural identity of different groups and persons. In some way, individual cultural identity is based on personal performance, and this is also conditioned by social class, by formal education, by region, by phenotypes. So there is no an easy way to identify what is the personal or cultural identity of each person. But this diversity is unequal, and there is we still have a colonial legacy that causes advantages and disadvantages according to where we are placed in this huge diversity. These hierarchies, this is a short version of these hierarchies during the colonial times, because there were the miscegenation, the social exchanges between these groups was creating a large list of categories to describe what was the race at the time of each individual. I don't know how many categories there are, but that was growing during the colonial times. So this is maybe half of this list of racial categories. But according to that racial identity, were defined access to property, access to education, access to administration, etc., etc., etc. Of course, in the base of that society were Afro-descendants, Africans and Afro-descendants, who were affected by slavery. Of course, the history is more complex. Not all the African people were slaves, but majority of them were under that cruel situation. And during colonial times and during the Republican times, Africans and African descendants fight for their liberation. And there were even moments where Africans and indigenous coalitions rebel against colonial powers. Even in the Tupac Amaru rebellion, the biggest rebellion during the colonial times, and for some people, the beginning of the independence process in Peru, this was at the end of the 18th century. Tupac Amaru rebellion was possible because there was also a coalition with African descendants. And after the independence, Criollo groups, this is the descendants of Spaniards, monopolized the state and left behind African people. That's the reason why the abolition of the slavery took 3 more decades after independence. And after the abolition, African Peruvians have been fighting for equality, especially during just to make short the history. In the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, they were involved with workers' unions. That was the way to canalize their aspirations of equality. Some of them were involved with leftist parties. In the second part of this century, there was a shift from equality to recognition. And this is related with the search of Peruvian negritude that we can say that in the 60s there was a very visible movement that includes poets, musicians, dancers, scholars who work on the self-affirmation and recreation of the Afro-Peruvian tradition. This was at the same time connected with different movements across the Americas. This is also something that is connected with civil rights movements in the United States, with other movements, especially in Brazil, in Cuba. These artists, writers travel all across the continent and build connections with different Afro-descendant intellectuals. At the end of the 60s, there was a military socialist administration in Peru. In that period also there was special, I can say, programs to include these artists in several national medias. There was special interest in the development of these kind of expressions. During the 80s, there were different Afro-Peruvian movements at local level who work with Afro-Peruvian communities. Also, issues related with identity and political organization at local level. And this process, in some way, was disturbed during the Fujimori administration, that was during the whole decade of the 90s. Due that Fujimori looked for the support of Afro-Peruvian groups, and this created a huge discussion and debate and conflict inside the Afro-Peruvian civil society. Because at that time this was not something clear, but there were many indices. Indicators that Fujimori, the administration of Fujimori, was committing violations of human rights. So this was at the beginning of the 90s. So there was a split in the Afro-Peruvian movement. Fujimori offered one congressman seat for them. So that was historically the first congressman. Actually was a woman, a congresswoman for Peru during that period. At the end of the 90s, United Nations launched this project for the Congress against the conference, international conference against racism in Durban, in South Africa, and this implied to work with Afro-Peruvian civil society for years, and they were organizing different audience with local communities to elaborate a document that finally, this was a long process from the local level to also national and then international level. Afro-Peruvian groups work with Afro descendants in the whole region. There was a conference in Santiago de Chile. This was the year 2000, and they elaborate a document that finally was presented in Durban. And Durban declaration and program is very important in this history because it's the first time when officially the Peruvian state recognized racism as a structural issue in the country. Promise policies and programs to work on this issue. Before that, there was a denial about racism. Racism was something that, according to the official discourse, was impossible because this was a mestizo country. So the discourse about mestizaje in some way hide the issues about racism. But even the discourse about mestizaje is a contradictory discourse because mestizaje is based on the idea of fusion between Hispanic and Inca cultures. However, inside this concept of mestizaje, there is an idea about the superiority of Castellano and Hispanic culture over the Incas' language and culture. Okay, so what happened with Afro-Peruvians after Durban? I can show some statistics based on even in some investigations founded by the own Peruvian government in the last years. I can show here some information about these books where we can find this information. And as you can see, the 37 of Afro-Peruvians in the workplace has incomes that are below the minimum salary, which is around $230 per month. And only, as you can see, a minority of them can get more than $800. So that means that majority of them are in poverty. Housing conditions became worse after this earthquake. The emergency plan after the earthquake, that this was during the Alan Garcia administration, 2007, was put in the hands of a group of construction corporations run by white elite in Peru, and they just took the money and didn't do the job. There was a scandal of corruption, and the person in charge just died, so nothing happens. Other statistics about education, also a few minority of them finish college education. Actually, currently a third of young Afro-Peruvians are following a post-secondary program. However, the dropouts are very high because the economic challenges that they have to overcome. This is some other statistics. There are, as part of this colonial legacy, different categories that people who apply for Afro descendants. Negro, Moreno, Sambo, that comes from this colonial vocabulary. This is another research, very interesting to the method that they use. These researchers create 4,000 fake CVs to send to different job positions. This was just in Lima, so they put the same level of education, professional experience, etc., 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 and fake CVs where the difference was gender, ethnicity, etc., etc., etc. And the result was that the CVs that passed the screening and get the interview, the job interview, where majority of them were people who has some kind of European last names or phenotypes or etc., etc. Because what happened in Peru is that CVs until now include a picture. So we can see in this research how gender and ethnicity, how the market, the job market reproduces the colonial structure in the way as they offer access to jobs to different people. So if somebody had doubts about racism in Peru, this is a very clear way to show that there is racism. And racism shapes the access to jobs. Okay, after Durban, the policies that, before and after Durban, there are some policies that the state, or some instruments that the state has created to confront racism. In general, there is a criminalization of racial discrimination in the health, employment, education, and commercial sectors. 7 years ago was created the Ministry of Culture. This is something new. And inside this ministry, there is an office that is in charge of Afro-Peruvian policies, and that was created just 4 years ago. And last year, as part of the work of this office, the state approved the national plan for the development of Afro-Peruvians. And there is a critical piece in this plan that is the new census. Because one of the reasons, official reasons, to postpone or to avoid implementation or the design and implementation of policies and programs, specific policies and programs for Afro-Peruvian people, is the lack of official data. So now this census is going to offer this official data. So this is a critical requirement to the next step, which is the design and implementation of specific policies and programs for Afro-Peruvians. So there is also an alternative plan elaborated by Afro-Peruvians organizations. It's very interesting that the state plan or the process to elaborate the plan, the official plan, includes different meetings with Afro-Peruvian representatives. But the final document excludes something that is critical in this plan, which is reparations. So until now, that is not part of the state plan. But that was included in the plan of Afro-Peruvian organizations. So the official plan or the state plan includes policies to confront racial discrimination, policies to promote recognition, and to promote social inclusion. Of course, the census not only is going to give data for the Afro-Peruvian populations, but other ethnic groups. This is the first time after 77 years in Peru that a census includes the ethnic variable. And the data is going to be collected by self-identification. So next year we can see what happened. What is until now? What is the percentage of Peruvians with African roots? This is unclear. Some people think it's 1%, and some people think it's 10%. And it's unclear because, in some ways, also about personal performance, how people try to identify themselves in a country where you can find at least 2 or 3 or 4 continents in our ancestors. Okay. Oh yeah, this is something that. Okay. So. This is the questions that we are trying to answer in this research. How to improve the structural situation of Afro-Peruvian. In some way, this question includes these other questions, you know, how to resist the Hispanic neocolonial and neoliberal state in Peru. Is part of this colonial legacy, but also something that is confronted not only for Afro-Peruvians, but also for indigenous peoples in Peru. There is a discourse about interculturality as a answer, a more democratic answer against this this project to hegemonize, to assimilate the country to the Hispanic culture. At least in the last 10 years, this discourse also is part of the official discourse, but it's hard to change historical patterns, even in the sector of education, where is the first goal of this intercultural policy. So my idea, because this is a research that is in process, is to have a conversation about your impressions, about how we can figure out what is going on not only in Peru but in the region, in Latin America. Also to have to try to exchange experience, information about the process in other countries. So I'm going to stop here just to start with the conversation. Thank you.
Questions? Anyone else?
So you're saying that there's a transition when we move from these, movements of recognition into social movements. Do you think, and so, do you think that there is a break, a structural break, that is sort of like the end of the Mestizo project as a national project? Do you think that that is something that starts tracking, or do you just see a continuation of the same colonial legacies? What is the difference that allows those social movements, that allows the recognition? And the second part was, so we have policies, we have laws, we have departments of ministries, etc., but it doesn't seem to be translating into well-being. So
Yeah.
those two things, how are the policies affecting the Afro-descendant population, and do you think there was a break into the nation state as a Mestizo project?
So the Mestizo project is still there, and is I think until now is part of the dominant groups in Peru. The discourse that challenge that discourse, the groups that challenge that discourse are indigenous people, descendants, and other minorities. But the Mestizo is still the discourse of dominant classes in Peru. But there are some breaks, and it's something that now is part of a debate, because like 30 years ago, that was the only discourse about Peruvian identity. Now is something that we discuss, but it's still the official discourse. There is a debate even inside the offices of the state, especially, for example, in the Ministry of Education, Culture. There are groups that are pushing, trying to transform this hegemonic discourse about Hispanic culture, and there is inside the not only the ministry but also inside the civil society a debate about that. So could be a transition, but that depends how the new civil society is going to manage these issues. I think that is going to be a transition, but it's going to take. That means that you have to strengthen civil society identify with diversity. Takes time. That was. Oh yeah, of course. the policies is, we can have the policy, but we have to apply those policies. So we need also officials in the state identify with interculturality, identify with decolonial goals. That is not impossible, but that could happen. So, in some way, the decolonization of Peruvian state is to rethink the whole system. It's not just about this policy, it's about the economic system, the political system. And it's hard to do it in a neoliberal state. So it is required also to change the constitution. During the neoliberal state, for example, the situation of Afroperuvians get worse because the minimum salary was reduced like 50%. Before the neoliberal constitution, during the Fujimori period, the minimum salary was based on the family basket, which includes 2 adults and 1 minor. But that concept disappeared with the neoliberal state. It's just based on other kind of calculations. So now a family cannot support a family with a minimum salary in Peru. That affects directly the Afro-Peruvian population. Majority of them are working class.
I have a question about the political agenda of the Afro-Peruvian in Peru. What are their claims in terms of actually the public policies? What are the claims in Colombia? One sector of the Black social movement, they claim for land, autonomy, identity. Mm-hmm. They're claiming for a consulta previa, previous consultation, I think it is. Yeah. Some, affirmative action, some. So what are the claims in Peruvian?
Yeah.
But then how that, help you to understand the public policies, the racial policy.
Yeah, in Peru is a little bit different. They are not asking for territory rights because the history is a little bit different in Peru. That is part of the indigenous claim in Peru. So Afro-Peruvians, I think one of the critical demands is reparations. And then special policies for health, education, employment, and I think these are the main sectors. But no, there are no rights, or there are no demands for example, territory rights, which is related with ancestral population in Peru, which are indigenous in the Amazonia, especially Amazonia and their regions. Also affirmative actions to promote their participation at political level. For example, in the Congress, some affirmative actions promoted access to the Congress or other political spheres.
But that's, you know, like every social organization in Peru claims that, or you have tensions within the Peruvian, Afro-Peruvian movement?
No, because the situation of Afro-Peruvians is more marginalized than other minorities. Other minorities, for example, Asian minorities from China, Japan, Korea, or Middle East minorities are in a different situation. This is something that is claimed just for Afro-Peruvians. And of course, there are these also indigenous organizations claiming for their rights. But
But within the Afro-descendant movement, there are not.
inside the
Yeah.
oh yes,
Yeah.
of course. Oh, sorry, I misunderstood your question. Of course, there are tensions. But at least in the plan that they developed, that was finished 2 years before the state signed this new plan, they worked together and create this proposal that the state took just partially, excluding the more controversial issues. So yeah, there are tensions. There are some kind of rivalry in some organizations, but what I can see is that when they have to work together. And that happened also when they worked for Durban. Even at that moment, the tensions were extreme because some part of them were working for Fujimori and the other part was not. At that moment, was clear that Fujimori was a dictatorship, a dictator, but they have to work together for Durban.
What year was the video of Alan Garcia? The one that you showed us when he said sorry, or
that should
that he forgives the slaves.
that should forgive those slave owners. Yeah. You wanna see it?
No, what year was it?
2009.
9.
No, Alan Garcia was terrible, and there were some external reasons to perform that ceremony. One of them was that the review of Durban was that year, and Peru was going to fail because he didn't do nothing about the program of Durban. And the other reason was that that year, like 4 months before that ceremony, there was a massacre in the indigenous, in the Amazonian region, what is called the Baguazo, where there was a confrontation between police forces, assault forces, indigenous citizens, because the Peruvian state offered to one U.S. oil corporation the license to explore and to exploit oil in indigenous territories. So, and that was the last or the worst massacre until now during this century. So there were two big issues, and they tried to perform a ceremony in some way to.
The cultural group.
Yeah, was like to cover the bad thing. I don't know if there is another question.
Well, just curious. I know this is some speculation, but how likely are Afro-Peruvian people of African descent to identify as Afro-Peruvian? You mentioned that this was an critical piece of the census,
Yeah.
and I'm just curious. I guess the context for that kind of thing.
It's very interesting
Yeah.
because if you live, especially there are some rural areas in Peru with a very strong Afro-Peruvian identity, like Yapatera in Piura, Saña in Chiclayo, Chincha in Ica. There are some places with this very strong African Peruvian identity. So people who live in these areas, majority of them identify themselves as Afro-Peruvians. And actually the information that I show here, this information is based on that data. But at the same time, if this also is related with social class, you can see in Peru people in high class with African phenotypes, but they never declare themselves. It's very strange if they declare themselves African descent, because it's about social class and personal performance. So because all these colonial prejudices against African people, so some people try to avoid that category, to avoid at the same time social discrimination in some way. Pardon.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for the presentation. I think it's a great project. I don't know, any project that tries to trace the history like this up to the present. Was thinking to the questions that in the Durban, through the Durban process, that people, Afro-Peruvians, came together in spite of their differences. But then around 2011, when there was an important split of the networks of the Black movement in Latin America, one of the main issues was the conference in Honduras that was in the middle of there was a coup d'etat there, and it was, the government was sponsoring the summit in Honduras, and the sector of the Afro-Peruvian people went there, and the other one criticized, like, Jorge Ramirez, etc., went to Honduras, while Oswaldo Bilbao, etc., opposed. So that split in the region, you have that in Peru. That leads me to my question, which is, one of the things that I found interesting in that genealogy that you're making from equality to recognition, is the relationship with the left, and also your decolonial perspective, and there is a tension there, the long-term tension. You can trace it to Mariátegui, Jose Carlos Mariátegui, in the 7 S's of Interpretation of Peruvian Reality, had very bold anti-black racist remarks. And, apart from black people, most people, don't even notice that. Don't notice that the indigenistic Peruvian left have this tradition of anti-black racism, even within the Peruvian left. And I remember going to two conferences important, like they were almost social forums of Peru, one in 2004 and one in 2010. And I think Millie was there. Millie's not here anymore. And you know, all the social movement were represented in those two big ass meetings in Lima, and the Afro-Peruvians were not represented there. So I think it's one interesting question there is, you know, to trace that problematic relationship between Afro-Peruvian organizing and the Peruvian left. It's a question that I'm sure that you have been through it.
Yeah, I think that during the 20s, the Peruvian left tried to, in some way, to solve the issues about race, including that inside the issues about class. So they thought, or they offered the solution that if we equalize different groups, so if we solve the issue about redistribution, we are going to solve the issue about race. And that was naive. In some way, that was something that maybe the Cuban experience can show. Because there was a redistribution, but there was no recognition in Cuba. In some way, the opposite happens in northern Brazil, especially in Brasilia, where you can find recognition, social recognition, but not redistribution. It's like the opposite, you know. I think that the Peruvian left needs to rethink their approach to race. It's more structural, it's more ideological, it's not something that is so simple like a consequence or an effect of inequality in the redistribution. This is something that is a pending conversation and debate inside the Peruvian left. Miguel Lobaton, who was a guerrilla leader during the 60s, was Afro-descendant. He said that during the 60s, after the meetings between all these leaders in the Peruvian left who were very inspired by the Cuban Revolution. In fact, Miguel Lobaton was inspired also by that revolution. After the meetings, all of them during the weekends went to the beach, and some of them went to the exclusive beach for high class. Some of these leftist leaders belongs to the Peruvian aristocracy. And some leaders like him went to Chorrillos, the popular beach where working class would enjoy the summer. That was during the 60s. So as an example of how these racial issues were even inside the most progressive political groups in Peru. There was a question. Yeah.
Yes. On the same question, 2017 was very difficult to recognize. For example, my grandfather, Afroperuanos,